for you to look forward to as well. I suspect that the first verse of chapter 11 is a familiar one. Most folks have heard this statement before, but I will confess to you the meaning is a little difficult to come by. If you cast bread on the water, I can't really think of any reason why it would be useful, personally. It soaks up the water, it falls apart. I'm hard-pressed to think of any real value of casting bread upon the water. I want you to think about that for a moment. Now, I have used bread as catfish bait, but I had to make it into a ball and put it on a hook and throw it in the river. I don't think I was ever very successful. I found that chicken liver worked a whole lot better, but I digress. Chapter 11, verse 1. Cast your bread upon the waters, for you will find it after many days. Give a portion to 7 or even to 8, for you know not what disaster may happen on earth. What in the world is Solomon saying? Let me answer that question by raising several issues. The verse is well known, but admittedly difficult. I've just confessed that to you. Don't claim to have all the answers and not even sure about some of the questions. So here is how this verse has been interpreted. Some of the interpretations, I think, can be dismissed rather quickly. Others need serious consideration. There are those who hold that it is a prophetic appeal to Israel to embrace Jesus as the bread of life. I think that's nonsense. I see nothing in Ecclesiastes that would lead me to believe that Solomon is thinking 1,000 years into the future of the advent of Jesus and saying to Israel, when he comes, he'll be the bread of life and you need to accept him. Now, understand that throughout early New Testament history, there are many things that are said in figurative fashion that are to be understood as figures, and I don't dispute that at all, but I'm not convinced in the least that this is one of them in Ecclesiastes. A second analogy is that Solomon is recommending that folks engage in maritime trade. He did have his own navy, and he did dispatch ships from Israel into distant places, and they returned about every 3 years loaded with cargo. One of the sources of his tremendous wealth was his willingness to be adventurous on the sea. I don't know if in some small way that may have been on his mind or not. I doubt it, but I can't rule it out. The third is that it's simply a general encouragement to conduct business. And it may be that those who think this way are thinking of bread in terms of financial, monetary means, and saying invest it and it will return with a profit over time. That may well be a valid argument if you make the right investment, but if you invest in the wrong things, you may end up with nothing. I doubt that that's what he means, but it's possible. The fourth is an appeal to philanthropy, to be generous and share what you have with those around you. And there is always the possibility that you may be at some point in your life on the receiving end, and the more generous you've been with more people, the more likely it is you'll find somebody that will be generous with you and come to your aid. And then the fifth is an illustration of living by faith. In my judgment, and I just label it as that because I don't have a definitive answer here for this verse. The meaning is most likely a proverb about sharing with others. Bread represents your resources, and casting them on the waters means distributing them to those in need, and to divide one's portion with as many people as possible. He says 7 or 8, just numbers that imply more than 1 or 2, and it will be a worthwhile endeavor. There are rewards just in giving and in helping, but there are also benefits, in fact, as we've already said, when one finds himself or herself in need and can turn to others that he or she has helped in the past. So one never knows when he may be in need. The more people a man has helped, the more there are to reciprocate if misfortune comes his way. Now, did you at the outset when we read the verse think of any one of these 5, or did you come up with a different meaning than the ones that we've shared this morning? Obviously, if you have a different meaning and you want to tell us, you're going to have to speak loud enough for me to hear, and I don't know if you're willing to do that or not. But this pretty well exhausts what scholarship says about this particular verse, and it clearly is not to be taken literally, because throwing bread on the water is just wasteful. And I think all of us would agree that that is not something that God would condone, nor a wise man like Solomon recommend. But what he is using is some kind of analogy or metaphor that perhaps was understood better 3,000 years ago than we understand it today. But I still tend to think that the 5th explanation is probably the best. It certainly ties in 1 with 2, casting your bread on the waters, and then 7 or 8, and how this may come back to be a benefit later. But I'll let you mull that over in your mind. If you have any questions at all, be sure to bring them up next Sunday. Verse 3, if the clouds are full of rain, they empty themselves on the earth. 3,000 years ago, they understood something about weather. They recognized that often clouds form over the oceans, they come ashore, and they drop their loads, rain. And if a tree falls to the south or to the north, in the place where the tree falls, there it will lie. Now, these are just observations that a wise man makes from his own personal experiences. He's observed how the weather operates, and the clouds form over the Mediterranean and come from west to east and pour out their content on Palestine. And in this case, I think in Jerusalem in particular, because this is the capital of Israel, where Solomon, we acknowledge to be the author of Ecclesiastes, reigns. Pretty common sense observation. And then he says the tree that falls to the south or to the north, it stays where it falls. Duh. I think that's pretty obvious as well. But he's making a point. What is the point? What's meant by the reference to the clouds and to the fallen tree? Well, I think these things illustrate for us that man is powerless to stop certain things. We can't control the weather. Now, up until relatively recently in the history of human civilization, we would all agree that that's the case. Now we're being inundated with arguments to the contrary that we are, in fact, as human beings, impacting the climate. And they want to make a distinction between climate and weather when the climate and the weather are not beneficial to their argument. But when the weather gets really bad, really hot, and it's dry, all that's climate change. But when we have lots of snow and lots of rain, that's just weather. And we're going to make a distinction because that's the only way we can justify our argument. In fact, 12 years ago, this whole country was pretty much supposed to be underwater, wasn't it? The oceans are rising, and the glaciers are going to all melt, and we're just going to be overrun while Florida's going to be gone. 12 years ago. As far as I know, it didn't happen. I'm not really expecting it to happen because I still believe, and I know this is old-fashioned, but I still believe God is in charge of climate and weather, not man. But that's just me, and you can ignore it if you choose. But we can't control the weather. And some actions have permanent consequences, like a fallen tree. It remains where it fell. Well, of course, you may say, what if somebody comes along and cuts it into chunks and splits it and uses it for firewood? Well, that could happen. But there's an explanation for why it doesn't stay where it remains, human intervention. But if you just look at things as they happen out here in our environment, whether by disease or by wind or storm or whatever, when a tree falls, you walk through the woods, it's exactly where it fell, unless somebody's intervened and used it for firewood or some other purpose. So when one walks through the woods, he can see countless trees that have fallen by wind or disease. When I was a boy, a long time ago, I just thoroughly enjoyed being out in the woods. And there was lots of acreage to walk over. My family, not so much my dad, but my uncles and aunts, and there were hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands, of acres that we had access to. And one of the things that I noticed, I couldn't tell you how old I was, but I wasn't very old, is that there were just logs scattered everywhere, rather substantial logs sometimes. And when I would ask my dad, he would say that's the result of the chestnut blight. The chestnut blight came through and destroyed the chestnut tree as one of the major hardwoods here in Appalachia. And there was evidence of that pretty much everywhere you looked as you walked through the woods. And where they fell, that's where they stayed. And that's to be expected. So Solomon, in my judgment, seems to be saying that it is in man's best interest to trust the natural course of events. Wisdom tells us that we cannot control everything. Now, did you get that from the verse that we just read, verse 3? Obviously, the clouds form and drop their water over land. We know that. And trees fall and they stay where they fell. If they fell to the north, they stay to the north. If they fell to the south, they stay to the south. Well, what does he say? He's saying that there are just some things that happen. They are the natural course of events, and we must just accept that they happen and that we cannot do something about everything. Would you agree with that? You don't have to respond, but aren't there things out of our hands? I remember John Dollison in one of his talks, either at the table or Wednesday night, made the observation that only Jesus could actually control the weather. He spoke, "Peace, be still," and the wind stopped, and there was a great calm. Nobody else. But Jesus had that power to control the weather. Nobody today has that power. And no collective group has that power either, by the way. We must accept that some things happen and we're helpless and hopeless to do anything about it. Hurricanes here in this country, over in the east, typhoons, they just happen. And they can be extremely devastating, especially when you build close to the water. You would think eventually we'd figure out that it's not very bright to build that close to the water if we want our houses to stand. But we don't. We keep building more and more expensive beach homes to see them destroyed, and then the government steps in and rebuilds them. But government's never been known for its wisdom. Correct, Michael? Thank you. He knows. There's just some things out of our hands. That's what Solomon is saying. Accept it. Live with it. Take care of the things that you can take care of, and the others, acknowledge your limitations. He who observes the wind will not sow, and he who regards the clouds will not reap. You notice how he takes these very ordinary kinds of things and makes observations regarding them that are vital to living a successful, productive, meaningful life. If one watches the wind, what will he not do, and why? Watching the wind. A farmer cannot rely on his own powers and abilities because, again, he can't control everything that happens. This is very much akin to the previous statement. A hesitant man does not sow because he thinks the condition of the wind will make sowing counterproductive. It does make it a lot harder. He believes the strong winds will scatter the seed. Another man looks at the clouds and does not reap because he thinks they will bring rain. And both illustrations are designed to warn or teach against procrastination. It's putting things off. We need to do our work and trust God to bless it. So when conditions are not ideal, and they often aren't, we must trust God to reward our hard work nonetheless. These kinds of conditions can make doing work much more difficult, but they're not excuses for not doing what needs to be done. You know, some people are just frightened into inaction, like the one-talent man who said, "I was afraid and I buried your talent. Here it is, you can have it back." I think about the story I read years and years ago from a preacher in Arkansas who put a book together of humorous stories. And he told about a southern farmer sitting on his front porch when a traveler passing by approached for a drink of water. And as they carry on conversation, he asked about his crops. How are your potatoes doing? Didn't plant any. Afraid of potato bugs. How's your cotton doing? Didn't plant any. Afraid of boll weevils. You get the story? Finally, he said, "I didn't plant nothing, just played it safe this year." And I thought, this is how a lot of people operate. They think doing nothing is the safe course, and it is often the most disastrous course we can take. Stop making excuses for doing what needs to be done and just do it. That would be Solomon's advice. Will you always succeed? No. But you can never succeed if you don't try. So stop putting things off and get to work. Verse 5. As you do not know the way of the Spirit comes to the bones in the womb of a woman with child, so you do not know the work of God who makes everything. Now, there are other translations that translate this word spirit as the wind, and you don't know or understand how the wind works, and we really don't. Even to this day, those who study these kinds of things are at a loss to really explain them. And the word, as you well know, can be translated wind or spirit, and so there is some problem in the minds of scholars as to which is the appropriate response here. It seems to me that just looking at the verse in context, that he's not talking about wind. He's talking about the Spirit, which is that part of us which is made in the image of God. And since he's talking in terms of how the child develops in the womb, it seems to me to be pretty obvious that he's saying we don't understand how the child in the womb, how the Spirit enters the womb, and we don't understand how that child is even formed, how it develops in the womb. the bones and everything else that is involved. And keep in mind that the child in the womb is a distinct human being at conception. That little boy or girl has its own unique DNA. It is not just tissue. It's not like a gallbladder or tonsils or adenoids. It is a human being. And no, we don't understand all the technicalities of how God made this miracle, and I use miracle here for something that is just impossible to fully comprehend and describe. How that little child grows in the womb to be a distinct human being is a God-given act of creation. I was reading here recently Thomas B. Warren, who was well known for his defense of Christianity and his debating atheist, posed a question for the atheist: can you just tell me which came first, the woman or the baby? And no one's able to answer that unless they're willing to accept Scripture. And then it's pretty obvious, isn't it? And where does everyone after the original pair originate? From that original pair. And the mathematics are such that it really isn't at all difficult to conceive of starting with 2 and being today in an environment where we have 8 billion plus people. That can be accomplished over a relatively short time, believe it or not. You can do the math, others have. Some of God's works are difficult, if not impossible, to comprehend. Accept them, don't deny them. So what is said to be mysterious and what is illustrated by it? So here's what we would take from verse 5. Man does not know how the Spirit enters a child in his mother's womb. The New American Standard Bible says it doesn't know the path of the wind. I'm rejecting the NASB on this particular verse. You're welcome to accept it. It just seems to me that, as I said earlier, the context would imply that both statements revolve around the same phenomenon. Nor do we know how bones are formed in the womb. The point is that God's works sometimes defy explanation. I would say that there are many times when God's works defy explanation. Many stories in the Old Testament that we know and know well cannot be explained from any human, earthly, material perspective. How did gazing on a brass serpent in the wilderness deliver those who had been bitten by poisonous snakes from death? You can stare at a brass snake forever today if you get bitten by a copperhead or a rattlesnake, and it's not going to make any difference at all, but it did then. And how can washing 7 times in the Jordan River make a leper clean? What was there in the waters of the Jordan River that cleansed leprosy, and why did it take 7 washings or dippings? And you all know as well as I do that the water really has nothing to do with it. God made the leper whole, but he did not do it until the leper had done what he was told. When people want to argue about the essentiality of baptism, I think this story is just as telling and revealing as any in the Bible about sometimes what God promises and what he demands have no real correlation with the promise that will be received, other than the person acts on faith and does what he or she is told to do, and then and not until then do they reap the benefits or rewards that they sought. I am hard-pressed to think of any situation in terms of salvation where God has always demanded faith, that faith has not been required to be demonstrated through some act or action. And we just finished recently our study of Hebrews. It may seem like it was forever ago, but just recently. And Hebrews 11 makes the point over and over again that these great men and women of faith are remembered because their faith was living, not dead. Each one did something or some things that validated their faith. Abel offered a more excellent sacrifice. Noah built an ark. Abraham moved when God told him to move, not knowing where he was moving to. And when the promised child came and he was told to take him to Moriah and offer him on the altar, he doesn't hesitate, he goes. We learn later that he believed that God could raise him again. He had that kind of faith. That's why he's commended. God has always expected faith to be demonstrated by some act or series of actions. And we may not always understand how God works. In Deuteronomy 29:29, Moses wrote, "The secret things belong unto the Lord." They're just things that no matter how hard we try, we're never going to figure out this side of eternity. That's okay. We don't have to know everything, just the essentials. But we know one who does know everything. And he has revealed to us the essentials. The non-essentials, they will come at a later date. So, in my judgment, Solomon is pointing to the marvelous act of conception and the development of the child in the womb and saying, we don't really understand it, but we accept it. God is in charge, and we just acknowledge his role. So put your trust in God, and don't let your ignorance hinder you from doing what you know to do. In the morning sow your seed, and at evening withhold not your hand, for you do not know which will prosper, this or that, or whether both alike will be good. Now, I think I mentioned to you at some point here recently that the typical work week in biblical history was a 6-day week. This is for Israel. I was interested in Ezekiel here recently, so I've been reading Ezekiel. Don't take us there, Michael. I don't want to teach that. I have too many questions right now. Give me another 20 years to learn. But Ezekiel mentioned we work 6 days, and the 7th day is our day of rest. And it typically was a 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. work day, 12 hours. You think you've got it rough if you work 8? Well, the typical work day was 12 hours, and it was often very hard work. Remember the story that Jesus told in Matthew 20 about the fellow who hired workmen at the beginning of the day and agreed to pay them a penny, a day's wage, a denarius? He hired men right up to the 11th hour. They only had to work 1 day or 1 hour that day. But when he paid them, he started with the guys that had worked the 1 hour, and he paid them a full day's wage. When he got to the folks who had worked all 12 hours, they just got a day's wage as well. They were not very happy. And Jesus, in his parable, pointed out to them that they had no reason to complain. They got exactly what was agreed upon. The money didn't belong to them. If the master who had hired men at the 11th hour wanted to give them a full day's wage, that was between him and them. It's none of your business. I think there's a valid argument there that has been overlooked a lot of late in modern society. Everybody wants to be treated equally, and it doesn't always happen that way. But I digress. That's another story for another time. In this particular setting, the advice that is offered, I think, is pretty obvious, and the basis for it just as well. A man has to trust that his activities will be fruitful. Do you know when you start to do something how it's going to turn out? You have in your mind this vision. But what I've discovered, even when I have thought it out really well, it never quite goes the way I anticipated it. I've, over the years, needed to help my children on many, many projects, and I've said to them, oh, that's a minor thing, couple of hours. And a week later, I'm still working on it. That seems to be pretty typical of me, and I suspect some of you have had similar experiences where things just haven't gone as you planned them. They often don't. So you have to trust that your activities will be fruitful, since you don't know which will succeed. And here he's contrasting labor in the morning with labor in the evening. He may sow in the morning or he may sow in the evening. The sower is ignorant of knowledge as to whether the morning seed, the evening seed, or both will be good or both will be bad. He just doesn't know. But he still works from dusk to dawn, trusting God that his efforts will be fruitful. If it is something worthwhile, put your best efforts into it. Will you always succeed? No. But you can never succeed if you don't try. And you have no way of knowing exactly what role the hand of God will play in your endeavor. I believe in providence, don't you? That God still is active in the affairs of men, and in particular in the lives of his children. And so all that we do with an understanding that we will give it our best shot, and we can't guarantee the outcome, but we can guarantee that God will be with us and bless us as he sees fit. Sometimes there will be great success, and yes, sometimes there will be failures, but the failures may, in fact, be much more beneficial than some successes and may prepare us for something down the road that we know nothing about, but of course the Father does. I think often of Paul's situation. I don't know what his thorn in the flesh was, but I know that he wanted to be shed of it. And he asked God, take it away. Now, you would think that a man in the position of the Apostle Paul would hear a ready and favorable response to such a request. He is an apostle. He has suffered immensely for the sake of the gospel. He has jeopardized his life over and over and over again. And it may well be that he thinks if he can be rid of this thorn, that he could even be a more effective minister. But what does God say? No. In fact, it seems to me he's essentially saying, I don't even want to hear about it anymore. You've brought it to my attention. My response has been each time, no, my grace is sufficient for you. And then he goes on to say, but I've discovered that it's in weakness that I am made strong, that the difficulties that I have to deal with actually make me better. And I don't think it's any different for us today. The difficulties, when approached and handled properly, actually do make us better, just as Paul's thorn made him better. So, trust in God and act. Don't be a coward and do nothing. Light is sweet, and it is pleasant for the eyes to see the sun. So if a person lives many years, let him rejoice in them all. But let him remember that the days of darkness will be many. All that comes is vanity. There's nothing wrong with living a long life and a good life. I think there are some who operate under the false premise that you can't really be happy and enjoy being alive as a Christian. But he's addressing those who are alive, those who can see the sun. He said, in essence, take advantage of the time that God gives you. But know that there will be difficult days ahead as well. So the question is raised, what advice and what warning are offered regarding life? And the response is, as far as I'm concerned, being able to enjoy light and see the sun is a gift that only the living possess. The dead do not possess such an advantage. Light is pleasant because it offers opportunities to do something. Jesus said in John 9, verse 4, after giving sight to the man who had been born blind, I must work the works of him who sent me while it is day. The night cometh when no man can work. Now, if you read that and you think that Jesus is talking about that period when the sun sets until the sun rises, you're mistaken, because what he's saying is make the most of life while you're alive, because someday you're going to be dead. And then you can't do anything. It's over, you're finished. So work while it is day, because night, that's death, comes, and work has to cease. So take advantage of opportunities. A long life is a blessing to be enjoyed, but know that there will be difficult times too. And Solomon had experienced all that life had to offer, but he also had some real heartache in his life. Don't bemoan what you should have done or could have done, but rejoice every day in every day you're given. There is a tendency for folks to either live regretting the past or daydreaming about the future. And the past is not to be forgotten and the future is not to be ignored, but if you live in the past or live in the future, you miss out on the present. And in my judgment, Solomon's saying that's a tragic, tragic mistake. Make the most of the day. It's all you have. Live it fully and enjoy what it has to offer, but know that not every day is going to be easy and full of joy. There will be difficult days ahead as well. Take them as they come. Rejoice, O young man, in your youth, and let your heart cheer you in the days of your youth. Walk in the ways of your heart and the sight of your eyes, but know that for all these things God will bring you into judgment. So he's addressing the young man, and this theme about the young will continue into chapter 12, and Kurt will have some things to share with you about that next Sunday. What advice is therefore given to young men? A young man should be happy and optimistic and enjoy carefree days of youth. And there is that period in life where you don't have a lot of burdens, a lot of cares or worries. And he says, if you're at that time in your life, enjoy it, because it doesn't last forever. So enjoy it while you can. He further encouraged the young man to follow the impulses, the ways of his heart. He's not suggesting that he be careless or thoughtless, but rather he should pursue what is intriguing or interesting to him. Find something you really like to do and do it, and it's not work. And that's the real challenge. If you can find something when you're young that you really enjoy and figure out a way to make a living doing it, you don't have to work in the negative sense in which we use the word. I know people who just Monday morning, they hate to get up and get out of bed because they have to go back to work. And I really feel for folks like that because I've never had that experience. I just can't wait to get up and get at it. But I enjoy what I do. And when you only do it one day a week, Harry was talking to me about that Wednesday night. It's easy to enjoy that day. I'm being facetious, of course, but this is what he's saying. Young men, figure out what it is in life that you really find interesting, intriguing, and give yourself to it. That's right. It's proper. It's okay. Maybe you're interested in space and technology and flying and all of that. Well, pursue a career in that area. Maybe you're just fascinated by the way things work on a molecular level. Be a chemist like Dennis. And every time Dennis speaks, I'm just sitting in awe because he's got all this knowledge about stuff that I find absolutely fascinating and don't understand at all. But I know he does. And Michael is a political animal, though he doesn't show it. He knows politics, and he can convey it in a way that if you pay attention, it's interesting as well as informative. A little alliteration there, interesting and informative. Michael likes that. I've got a message for you tonight that's built all around that. But find something you really enjoy and give yourself to it. That's what Solomon is saying here. Don't get stuck doing something your whole life that you just hate. Now, it may be that you're unable to do anything else, and that certainly can happen. I think in the coal fields of West Virginia, there were people that were stuck in the mines because they couldn't get out. And you can't honestly say that going down into the heart of the earth, digging coal by pick and shovel would be a really appealing way of making a living. But if you have to make a living, you'll do it if that's what you have to do. But the best advice is find something that you find really intriguing and interesting and go at it. The wise young man, or any person, should not choose activities that might be a stumbling block to a faithful relationship with the Lord. And then remove vexation from your heart and put away pain from your body, for youth and the dawn of life are vanity. What should be removed from the heart and why? Vexation, grief, and pain, sometimes translated anger. The word can be used in either way. From the heart could also be translated grief and sorrow. Rid them from your heart because they hinder the enjoyment of life. It's about attitude. Bring the right attitude to the day and the day will be better. But the wrong attitude makes it difficult. It's better to be an optimist than a pessimist. The word translated pain or sorrow could also be translated evil. If one has the means to get rid of these things, he should. And in relationship to pain, it is certainly appropriate to see a doctor and make every effort to eliminate the pain as long as what is required is not contrary to God's laws. There were folks, believe it or not, who believed that turning to physicians was an act of turning away from God, an act of unbelief rather than faith, and really did not encourage it. Hopefully, we're not that archaic today. Solomon's saying it's fine to seek remedies for problems as long as you go about it in the right way. We have to quit. It says it's 9:46 on this clock. And next week, Kurt is going to finish Ecclesiastes, correct? And we will start Esther in 2 weeks, the Lord willing. Fascinating book, Esther. Why don't you read it 2 or 3 times? You've got 2 weeks to do that, but don't forget to read chapter 12. And now we'll take a break until 10 when we'll begin our worship.